finish this presentation up and go on. I think it seems like this card talked about. You get this rare. There are some practical times in which you'd have all the women have provision. All throughout the, like pirates and cavemen and astronomy and Isaac, and he was on this Mysteries of the Bible show, and he was always, I remember one of his commentaries on strife, and, but as a consequence of this, by the time we get to the rabbinic age, and even though it's kind of fallen out of favor and not really practiced, it does have a sort of ripple effect on commit adultery against her husband, but a husband can't commit adultery against his wife because obviously they have that polygamy law in the books. The adultery that he would commit would be against the other man who is the note holder of the marriage, is essentially how that worked in Jewish law. And so that's sort of one of the vestiges of polygamy. Even though it wasn't practiced, it had that effect. Rabbi Menachem ben Nafa, in the name of Rabbi Eliezer Hakapar, a case that Rabbi Tarfon, who betrothed 300 wives for them to eat teruma, for there were years of famine. You know? So there were reasons sometimes for this. It had a practical effect. Over time, and you'll see this in the prophets, monogamy gets taught as the ideal. You'll see this in Malachi. You'll see this, stay with the wife of your youth, and Proverbs, and all these different prophets kind of start elaborating this idea. I believe in the time of Malachi, you had a lot of Jews who were they were intermarrying with a lot of foreign pagan wives so that they could, like the Targums. You have the translators of the Septuagint, the Greek Septuagint. And Yeshua himself, they have a translational bend against polygamy. And so it started off rare in Canaan by the time of, I think, the Transjordanian migration, and it just became rarer still. But it was practiced. Therefore, shall a man leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. That's what it says in the Hebrew. But the Septuagint adds the two there to put a limitation on there in the Greek, which is interesting, and because it reflects the changing attitude of the times. And so when you see, Paul and Yeshua repeat that passage right there, it's citing the Septuagint version, which is very telling. So they were not polygamous. And so even the Qumran community themselves, they stood out stridently against polygamy, and they criticized the so-called builders of the wall. I guess maybe they were the same people as the Dorshei HaHarakot, exactly the same people, for multiplying wives. And so there's the Damascus document, and it was found in both Qumran and the Cairo Geniza. It's referring to the city folk, these wicked city folk, They are caught by two snares, by sexual sin, namely taking two wives in their lives, while the foundation of creation is male and female he created them. And those who entered the ark went 2 by 2 into the ark. And of the prince it is written, let him not multiply wives for themselves. So even though the early attitude was sort of an allowance in the Torah that, okay, we can't let women in the time of Gesh Begiva in the book of Judges. We can't have all these women just left over. Somebody has to be able to take care of them. And so it's sort of the social safety net back before there was a social safety net, if that makes sense. Going on ahead. Yes.
So would you say that really polygamy, if it was practiced, it was really a small sort of type practice, and primarily elites, primarily people of substantial means?
It seems like people of means are a lot of the people that are covered in the Bible. David, Shlomo, all the judges might have been chieftains, or many of the judges might have been chieftains, and so it's not oftentimes going to sit around miracles happening in the Tanakh, and you think, oh man, God was just so miraculous in the Tanakh all the time, but it's like you forget there's like hundreds of years separating each book, and so you got to have kind of a sense of perspective about these things. It's generally, I guess, in any society, the national literature is probably going to focus. I mean, if you read Homer, for example, most of the people fighting at Troy were aristocrats. They were wealthy enough to afford armor, and so it's like it focuses on the people that, I guess, were written about.
So even the stories we'll hear about do not necessarily reflect the broad population. A lot of times
No.
they focus in and zero in on these people who have renown, who have some claim to fame or something makes them remarkable and
Yeah.
outstanding.
Yeah.
Wives are expensive.
Yeah, that's another thing. Wives are very, very expensive. No, there's a lot of seriously, there's a lot of in Exodus it describes you have to provide for your wife in the same way that you would provide for your bond servant or your eved or whatever you called it. And you were on the hook for that, you know. And so there's an old Jewish proverb that says that he who takes a slave takes a master, you know. And it's like you know, in Sharia-based countries, you know, it's very few people at the top who might be able to have multiple wives, and everybody else, you'll be lucky if you get one, you know. It's yeah.
Something also to think about, and coming from kind of a corporate culture mindset, like the idea of like change management. Right? So getting adoption across the wide, adoption of your system or your approach or your laws, right?
Yeah.
So that they don't fully reject it. It's a strategy.
Yes.
Right? So this kind of touches on, like, in the theological realm, on the concept of dispensationalism.
Yes.
Namely the concept, you know, that can mean a lot of things.
FFOZ is dispensationalist. I think Lancaster is.
But
So.
mainly in the sense that humanity is like a child in the early stages. And there's a different set of rules for a child than there is for an adult.
Yeah.
And in the sense the nation of Israel, as it was raised to maturity, there was more restrictive rules, thus more defined rules on marriage.
Yeah.
Whereas there's a more permissive, loose at an earlier stage of maturity.
Well, it's like you have the Torah, and it made slavery very hard. Not turn them in. It's like the American chattel slavery in the South could not have existed under such a model. If you could flee from Atlanta to Macon or whatever, and you know, it wouldn't be profitable to be a slave master anymore because your slaves would just be evoking that law. And so it allows these things, but I think at the same time sets kind of a moral trajectory for a different horizon, if that makes sense. So, but polygamy officially was banned in the 11th century. That was Rabbi Gershom ben Judah of Mainz, Germany. And so it was never practiced anymore. It was just this vestigial, silly law in the books. And finally he just, I guess, executed it and just said, you know, we don't do this anymore. And that was put to bed. So anyway. So then there is the Yibum and the Chalitza. For some of you might be familiar with that. If brothers dwell together, and one of them dies and has no son, the widow of the dead man shall not be married to a stranger outside the family. Her husband's brother shall go into her, take her as his wife, and perform the duty of a husband's brother to her. And it shall be that the firstborn son which she bears will succeed to the name of his dead brother, that his name may not be blotted out from Israel. And you see some traces of this already in the book of Genesis with Yehuda and that little scandal of his. Yehuda had three sons, Onan, and Shelah, you know, and the first two die because they were wicked, and so you have Tamar, and she's waiting around for Shelah to perform the duty so that the two other brothers, their names could live on. So even though the Torah wasn't given, there's sort of this proto-idea in the Middle East that you don't let your brother's name die off. Now, today, there are some traces of it. They're very, in Israel, for example. So, let's see. Today, no rabbis will officiate a Yibum ceremony, and it has gone by the wayside. And there's a maverick rabbi. His name's Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. He was the Sephardi chief rabbi of Israel. He diverged and permitted Yibum in the case that a widow and in the case of a willing widow and brother-in-law, and there was a case. And so I think in that particular case it was allowed. But other than that, it's kind of forbidden. So, and not forbidden, it's just not done anymore. And so then there's the chalitza. It's the exemption ceremony, and this is hung on a bit longer. And if the man does not wish to take his brother's wife, then his brother's wife shall go up to the gate to the elders to say, my husband's brother refuses to perpetuate his brother's name in Israel, and he will not perform the duty of a husband's brother to me. Then the elders of the city shall call him and speak to him. And if he persists, saying, I do not wish to take her, then his brother's wife shall go up to him in the presence of the elders and pull his sandal off his foot and spit in his face. And she shall answer and say, so it shall be done to the man who does not build up his brother's house. And the name of his house shall be called in Israel, the house of him who has his sandal pulled off. Which but essentially it was a shaming tactic to say, okay, this person doesn't really care about his brother, and I guess this is the harshest iteration of Jewish guilt I've ever seen.
Nice shame ceremony.
Yeah, it is.
It's like, shame on you.
And believe it or not, there's about 15 to 20 chalitzot every year in Israel in the Orthodox community, in the ultra-Orthodox community. So what will happen, so for example, in a few Orthodox communities, a woman's husband might die childless, and she'll think nothing of it, and she wants to remarry, and then, snag. You're an aguna, because your brother-in-law has a claim to you, and you have a claim to your brother-in-law, default by your brother dying, or by your husband dying. And so they have to go through this ceremony. And they take off the shoe and they recite these recitations and they do all this stuff, and it's in public in the presence of a Beit Din. It's very embarrassing. And I read an article in, I think it was Haaretz, I forget which one. It was you basically had this modern woman. She was college educated. I think she had a 6-figure job, and her husband died, and she wants to remarry, and she doesn't want to marry her brother-in-law, obviously, and so she has to go through this really strange, arcane, embarrassing ceremony, because at the end of the day, it's like, well, you can't just ignore it. It's in the Torah. God said it, and so you have to bring it forward. And so,
Something also to add, go back to something you said the previous week, that we also fail to understand in our modern mind that this was a different world. Mm-hmm. And it had every connection to the land. Mm-hmm. And there was, my understanding is that there was, in those days, the law of primogeniture. Essentially, the firstborn was the inheritor. Mm-hmm. And so it doesn't say this directly, but if the firstborn died, and now that land's essentially up for grabs, right? And so the brother needs to step in a sense, as the landholder, and raise the family on that inheritance, because it was a tribal land allotment.
Not just that, but there could be a situation, I think, an incentive in which a brother would not want to. For example, if he himself doesn't have kids, then that means his first child would belong to his brother. And that could have some implications as far as inheritance as well, as far as, well, gee, I don't want to sap my household, and so that's probably why I could imagine in antiquity a lot of individuals would be against it. So, like Shelah, if he did end up marrying Tamar, his primogeniture would have gone to somebody else. Anyway, so.
Great.
Yes.
Quick question. In your study of this, I always wondered what happens if the surviving brother is already married?
Well, I mean, this was a time of polygamy, and so I mean, this would be, the yibum would be, I believe, permitted in that time and expected. But again, that would run in contra to Gershom ben Judah's ruling in the 11th century that we don't do polygamy anymore. And so that would probably be a reason that a rabbinical court wouldn't do it. They would just say, okay, just do the chalitza and the alternative and wash your hands of it. So.
Or a potential reason why a brother may not want to take his dead brother's wife because he's already married and got kids of his own.
Yeah. But I mean, he would have more of an incentive to take the wife because I mean, his primogeniture would go with his first kid. Whereas if you weren't married and didn't have kids, then it's like, well, pretty much the bulk of my household now belongs to my brother. It's like, oh, geez, who wants that? So I think that in the Bible Belt, we get that sort of dominates the conversation in the southeast of America about what biblical marriage is. And so people tend to think that throwing down your kerchief and Southern chivalry, or maybe those bodice-ripping romance novels, or Downton Abbey, or the British Monarchy, this is biblical marriage. No, it's not. It's not the 11th century French troubadours. It's not Romeo and Juliet, Tristan and Iseult, and it's not courtly and chivalric romance. Chivalry wouldn't come until much, much later, and it has more to do with obligations of nobles in Europe. And it's funny today, I think, it just as a little aside, something C.S. Lewis talked about. Everybody calls everybody else a gentleman nowadays, which is stupid because nobody's a gentleman. We're all peasants here. If you hold the door, you're still a peasant. It doesn't make you not a peasant. You're just, and so it's there's a bit of wobble between this terminology and a little bit of lexical drift over time. And so I think there was romance in the Bible. Obviously, you have Song of Songs, but it's important not to impose those customs and attitudes onto biblical marriage and what we say is quote unquote biblical marriage. I mean, it's kind of funny in a sense that Jews and the rabbis even today don't run around saying, well, we need biblical marriage, biblical marriage. They understand that the Torah doesn't change, but the interpretation and the application will change over time. They have a sensibility about that. So Jews kind of understand that they're not time travelers trying to just resurrect some antique age. They understand, especially modern Orthodox. Like modern Orthodox understands that they're not living in 15th century Poland, and anyway.
Even in Fiddler on the Roof, for example,
Say what?
right? Fiddler on the Roof, that scene, do you love me?
Do you love me?
The scene, right? It's they're like, they hadn't even thought of this question, right?
No.
And she's like, I cook for you, I clean for you, da-da-da-da-da, right?
Yeah.
I guess I do.
You guys weren't here. Yeah.
There's pragmatism there.
Yeah.
Right? Not to say that's
I
all
guess
it
I
is.
do. I do by you can just measure my deeds,
Right.
Yeah.
It's action-based, right?
Yeah. Somebody, you get your hand raised.
Yeah, well, in the previous page, you had that what marriage is not. If we take the point of view of the Song of Songs, there's a lot of romanticism in there.
There is, but at the same time, as I said, Shir HaShirim does have some romance in it, but in the sense that if you're living in the South and you go to Baptist church and you're in this community and you talk to you talk to the daddy of so and so, and I really like your daughter, and blah blah blah. And you decide to court, and he shows you his gun collection, and then but then we both love our daughter. We both love her, and we respect her, right? Yeah, we really do, don't we? And you really knuckle down on him. And then it goes through the motions, and then they get married in their local church. They'll say to themselves that Southern chivalric picture, that's biblical marriage, and ban that in a halakhic sense. So I mean, I know exactly what you mean, but I think people, when they use these terms, they just kind of throw them together interchangeably because again, the Bible Belt just kind of dominates the conversation on family values, and so anyway. So I talked about, and I guess the 2 or 3 of you back there weren't here last week because you're kind of snickering at this. Are you this is funny to you? Well, you're laughing at me. Okay, that's better. Okay, all right. Well, no, this is nostalgic. So I mentioned this last week, and I actually say that my verdict is that Joshua Harris's efforts were noble. I mean, he was trying to, by trying to espouse courtship, although I think his efforts were somewhat misguided, he was trying to create a richer married life. And for many, he did that. Well, even though on the other hand, people say that he ruined our lives, and we ended up crazy cat ladies at 35, and we don't have anybody. And so my 2 cents is this: for courtship to actually work, you can't do this in a vacuum. The Torah wasn't given in a vacuum. It wasn't given to one person. So for courtship to work, you have to have a critical mass of families that are actually in on the game, if that makes sense. So if you're living in a church in the South and maybe some of the families are doing this and some of the families are not, and then not only that, but you guys are about to graduate and go to college, and where courtship isn't anywhere. It's like you don't have the mechanisms in place to actually do that. I think it can be done, but I think that you need sort of a legal system and with some real teeth, because if you don't do that, courtship is so rare that you can kind of put your kid in a double bind. Whereas well, dating is sinful. I can't date. Dating's terrible. That's the secular world. But at the same time, this institution is not producing anybody for me. And it puts people in kind of this middling territory. And a lot of people that criticize this book talked about that. I waited and I did all the right things, and I didn't go date because dating's sinful, but my church didn't produce anybody for me. And so it's like, well, you have to have shidduchim, you have to have matchmaking. That's a thing. That's a real thing. And so I read an article not so long ago, well, maybe it was a little bit longer ago. They were suggesting, the title was, is Is Church Making Black Women Single? Or something, it was the title of it. And it was dealing with, you have these really religious people in a really religious community, and they're focused on all this outreach, but yet you have these single people in your own community, and you're not providing for them. You know what I mean? Go ahead.
So I have a question.
Yes.
So the premise of the first hypothesis that he had mentioned was the fact that waiting for a relationship until marriage is wrong. Is that what you're stating and that you're agreeing with in this?
Well, I'm actually not going to take sides on either one. What I am going to say is, I think courtship can be done. It is done in communities throughout the world still to this day.
Correct, but if we analyze the first two sentences right here, what he's actually alluding to is the fact that waiting for marriage is wrong, period. Read that structure of those two sentences and let me know if I'm wrong.
So,
I changed my mind.
So basically he said that kids shouldn't date at all. Period, zero. It should all be this kind of arranged thing between the families. And it's like, well, okay, that's good, but how many families are in on that game? And how many options do you have out there? And that's a real... In Messianic Judaism, for example, I'll just be really blunt. I was like in my late 20s, early 30s. There's not a lot of women in Messianic Judaism that were my age. And so I think you can do courtship. There are communities out there who do courtship, but you have to have the infrastructure in place. So, like, here example, New York Beit Din, okay? You have a Jewish community that has elders, that you have also a synagogue that might have somebody that specializes in matchmaking, shidduchim as well. You have elders that can oversee the marriage process, that can do marriage counseling, that can, God forbid, in the case of a divorce actually happens, give moral closure to both parties so that all throughout, you know. So okay, now courtship is possible because you actually have some teeth behind it, and you actually have families that are in on the game. You can't just do it in isolation. You can't just do it by yourself. And that's the challenge. And I think that's what a lot of people, you know, me and just this small hamlet of like a few other people actually do this. It's like you're not going to have a wide pool to choose from. And so I mean, like, this is the kind of thing that Beit Din... I actually reached out to the New York Beit Din and the Beit Din of America, and I asked them like 15 different questions, and they haven't gotten back to me because here's this stupid little... No, I imagine they have a big caseload, you know, but I mean, they deal in things like monetary arbitration, small claims, marriage ceremonies, get proceedings, halakhic determination of status, things of that nature. And so, you go ahead.
So something that I'm a broken record here, but part of what is, I think, in our modern mind that's hard to understand is that anybody who studied genealogy in ancient cultures, there's a term called endogamy.
Endogamy, yes, endogamy.
You know this term, but basically it's within ethnic groups, there tended to be marriage within the group. This is just the way it was in ancient days. And I mean, I visited a friend, this is so foreign to us in America now, but I visited a friend in Puerto Rico years back. He took me to where his mother's village was from, and he said, this is where my aunt lived, this is where my grandmother lived, all together.
Yeah.
And so you typically were marrying some kind of distant cousin, right? Yeah. Not your first cousin, hopefully.
Yeah, it's a lot of gray area.
There was a lot, and this was true in Ashkenazi Jewish communities and Sephardi, all over. And so there wasn't a lot of marriage outside of the group, and that's simply because proximity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, we are missing all of that context today.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think, as I said, I think that courtship can be done successfully in a sustained way, but there again has to be a legal and ecclesiological mechanism in place, kind of backing it. Otherwise, you know, I can't date, but you guys aren't giving me anybody, you know, and that's kind of the problem. That's the double bind that a lot of kids are in. So it is. I'm not going to say like, should we do that or shouldn't we do that? Like, that's up to MJ. Like I'm not going to say should we do that. I mean, I think that we should explore ways we could do that, in my personal opinion. But I mean, because you know, I'll get to it in a second. So here's just some questions. I just want to like top it off with, and I don't know how much time I have left. I can go into the next presentation if I have time. Are the vows in modern weddings too vague, or are they simply flexible? Thoughts? Because I went over before Like way up at the very top. I went over before in the ketubah, like this food, clothing, marital rights, the specifications that one party owes to another party, all these different things, and the dowry. So modern ketubot tend to be very ornamental. Should they be or shouldn't they be? What are your thoughts on that?
My first thought is, whatever they are, they should be vows, covenantally stated, so that it's not, when I met you, my life was complete, and I will be there for you, and you will be, all that stuff that goes on now, it takes the teeth out of you're standing before God and witnesses vowing something.
Yeah. So
We've lost that solemnity.
So you're saying that there's a lot of weasel language in like to have, to hold, to love, sickness, and so the idea being that
I don't mind those,
Yeah,
and I'm traditional. I mean, those
Yeah.
were our vows, but
Yeah.
those are good vows because
Yeah,
we made
sure.
a promise.
yeah. But here's another question following up on that: how much, like for example, in a ketubah, it would specify definite quantities of what you owe the other spouse and things of that nature. So let's say, for example, you have a wife and she's working really hard and she's got taking care of the kids, and there's this guy, let's say he's drinking beer and playing video games, and he's a total deadbeat. He's sitting on the sofa all day, right? Not out of the realm of possibility, right? And so she says, you're violating our marriage covenant. He's like, well, how? Because my definition of to have and to hold is a bit different than your definition of to have.
That is why I think
Yeah.
the divorce, and that's where I think you're saying we don't have a process for a person who's a Bible believer to get out of a situation that is untenable.
Yeah.
Because we just have this sort of vague, I said I would be there no matter what, and
What does that mean?
yeah.
I'm on the couch.
And if it is
I'm like,
untenable,
I'm here. I'm
there
on the
should
couch.
be just as valid a way for a person to get out of a marriage
Yeah.
without stigma.
Well, if you wanted to get out of a marriage, you'd have to make a charge, and the charge would have to be specific.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, to have, to hold, it's like, well, how do I build a charge out of that? And so that's
Became just, what was it? They used to call it, well, no fault divorce.
No fault divorce, yeah.
Irreconcilable.
Now it's funny. There was a marriage vow I read. It's from the medieval period in Salisbury, England. It was in some big tome of illuminated text, and it said it was the woman's vow, and she promises. She says, "I promise to be bonny and buxom on bed and board." Well, buxom didn't mean what it means today, but it's funny. It's very lyrical and sing-songy. I promise to be bonny and buxom on bed and board. So that's a thought. That's pretty much the same question. The next one. So here's a question. I have a friend of mine. He's looking at it from a purely like strict interpretation perspective of like, okay, are people who marry outside of Torah custom actually married before God? I think yes, but I mean, it was a question because like people convert to Judaism and they marry again, oftentimes, and they'll remarry as Jews, and so and I guess Paul had this problem of like all these people were pagans and they evoked Dionysius and Artemis and all these other gods and goddesses to be the wards of their wedding, their vows, and like are people married who were married outside of Torah customs? I think yes. Any thoughts on that? Like mutual recognition, perhaps? I think it's probably useful. Yeah.
I mean, I think it depends.
Yeah. Oh, so she's good. No, you say it.
Okay.
Finish what you're saying. I'll go to her.
I think it depends greatly because with the example you just cited out with basically cultures that are absolutely pagan,
Yeah.
in their interpretation of the world, that is problematic.
Mm-hmm.
So being married by the laws of Baal and
Yeah.
and Canaan versus being married under the laws of Israel,
Yeah.
Moses and Israel. So just even the vows and things like that. What are you obligating yourself to, and what standard are you going to be held accountable as?
Yeah.
That's really what it comes down to. When
Sure.
people don't have a standard,
Sure.
when they're just like, I'm going to be married to you because I want to be married to you. Like, okay, so that's that vagueness you're talking about. Like, what are you talking about? What kind of a contractual relationship is this? What kind of an agreement are you making, and what are the teeth that are going to enforce it? What are you losing in this if this goes south? You know, and so when there's no structure, there's nothing there. It's very difficult. And so I would say, the teeth are definitely needed. But then in some situations, it may be considered a common law marriage. It could be considered legal under the sort of say country definition that's very, very broad, but people who are religious might look at it differently.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Laura.
So I agree with what Peter said because there's different perspectives and point of views, and you brought up quite a few of them. However, there's one important point that I haven't heard is commitment.
Yeah.
Because all of these, it depends.
Your
It
attitude
doesn't
going
matter. Okay, what kind of vows I have? I can put whatever vows I like. I can, these are all requirements or asks or needs that I have that I want to be met in marriage. Whether the person can fulfill them or not is a different matter.
Yeah.
But I'm committed, and commitment is an important key in this whole thing that I haven't heard.
I agree,
this
but
discussion.
this presentation is coming at it more from a halakhic perspective, like what kind of institutions existed then and what kind of institutions could possibly exist now. So I could talk about the laws, but I can't really control the thoughts that are in somebody else's head. So I kind of wash my hands of it in a sense because I agree with you that's needed in a marriage, but I can't.
It's not enforceable.
Yeah, I can't say think this, I'm just coming at it from as an institution. And so we're not at disagreement. We're just talking about different things. So if you haven't heard it mentioned, it's not because I don't think it's not real. I think Tali and then you. Tali first.
Yes. So to be honest, after 28 years, I don't remember the vows we said. It's been a long time. I have the general idea what we said. Okay, and I can tell you that most of it after 28 years is watching a lot of football games in the beginning and watching the movies I like that makes the marriage. But I don't remember the vows. I don't know if anybody. I used to have it too, but.
Well, you might be a classic example. It might be more, Laura, as you said, Laura, more about attitude than just the halakha. But I'm coming at it just from the halakha because I'm not counseling people. I can't counsel people. So,
So the question was, does God is it recognized before God?
I've had people ask that. It's like, well, if you were a pagan, I don't think so. But I mean, like in the modern world, I mean, Christians I think are on Team Abraham. So
like in the Bible, would it be recognized as somebody being a wife if it was not recognized? I guess by. So I'm thinking like specifically stories like Potter's wife.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
It names her as his wife.
Yeah. Is that practical language or is that halakha? I don't know. I just don't know. I don't have an answer to this. Obviously, I'm asking the question. It's good. Yeah, we're not subject to halakha at the time. Pharaoh wasn't Jewish, and so Jewish law, he wasn't under that system, and so. There was no halakha either. There was no Torah given. I mean, there was a supernal Torah with God in the ether, but it wasn't, given to mankind. So, go ahead.
So something I think that conceptually we have to identify is that there's always kind of this gap between what is and how we describe it, like the physical thing. Mm-hmm. And it kind of comes down to your philosophy of language. Like, are you a postmodernist? Like, so in other words,
have no fixed
gender can be separated from biological sex. If you're a postmodernist, yes. If I call myself a giraffe, I can be a giraffe.
Oh, yes.
Right? But
you have to honor that.
I would argue the biblical worldview is extremely pragmatic.
Yes.
And word and deed need to match.
Yeah.
And so, in a sense, it's which came first, right?
Yeah.
Well, the deed is first, right?
Yeah.
So the act of marriage, the physical reality of marriage, which within the context of the culture, the ethnic, the whole milieu, right, it is essential to understand.
Yeah.
And then you understand that the formality, the signed document or whatever, is important.
It is.
But it's sort of like baptism, right? And
Yeah.
the church, right? We know you aren't saved by baptism, but you go to
Yes.
Baptist church, et cetera.
Yes.
This
You're
concept comes
saved
from-
by the decision to get
Right,
baptized.
it's
Yeah,
not merely an outward symbol of
Yeah.
an inward transformation,
Yeah.
right?
So do you think that in the old times there were vows? Because in the
Yes.
Bible it says that Isaac went, or Rebecca went into Isaac's tent and she was his. So-and-so
Yeah.
went into somebody else's
I-
tent
I-
and
I
they're
think-
his. That's it.
I think it might just be skipping some details. You wouldn't get there is some horse trading, no pun intended. When Eleazar arrives in Padan Aram, he's talking to Lavan, and he's bringing gifts, which is a down payment, and then they ask Rachel, for example. And, it was Rivka. Sorry. Will you go with this man? And that was actually a consent vow, I think, and a lot of people take that as a consent vow. As I said last time, it's a weird thing to include in the story, and the story could have done without it completely. Rachel, Rivka, will you go with this man? But it might not have been sort of a poetic flourish. It might have been her giving her consent in proxy. And so I think a lot of times people see just people, and so-and-so knew so-and-so and went into the tent. And I think just pragmatically, the Bible's very curt. I mean, again, if you read Homer, it's very detailed. If you read the Bible, it's very spare. And so it's probably just jumping over the whole ceremony and all this other stuff and the narrative and just going straight to, and he knew her, because that's ultimately the clincher, So, but yeah, so I think vows existed. They had to have existed back then. So yeah, go ahead.
I think you're right about that. The former part,
What?
the contractual part,
Yeah.
because she was given the jewelry,
Yeah.
and then after the meeting with the parents, she's asked, "Do you want to go with him?"
Yeah.
And the moment that she agrees to go with him, she knows what's next.
She knows. Yeah. It's kiddushin. It's she's now sanctified to this patriarch.
Right.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So, I have a question. Are people who marry outside Torah customs actually married? What about people that get married at the lake?
Lake.
Get married at a lake.
A lake.
Like, yeah, they
Yeah.
go to the lake, and they have a...
Like
The lady of the
I don't know what you mean. Okay. Well, we'll talk about that. We'll elaborate on it later. So, and this is a question I think is very important, especially for MJ. I'm sorry, we got a ton of people, so go ahead.
I guess my question is more in line with hers.
Yes.
Right? If you think about the first marriage, right? Adam and Eve, we don't see any vows. Doesn't mean that they're not there, we just don't see them. And
I'm
then-
going to get to that just next.
That's one thing. The second thing, right? The other example of that is when we have Abraham and Sarah, and we have Hagar, right?
Yeah.
So the Bible says, or the Torah, Scripture says, right, and that Sarah gave Hagar and Abraham to wife. He went into her, and she became his wife. So,
That's right.
in my mind, when God looks at marriage, is it the covenant that is coming together, the covenant, right? Or is the vows I speak it?
I think the vows, because you could technically do something illicit with somebody, and that wouldn't necessarily be. Now, if in the Torah they had a sort of a you broke it, you bought it mentality, because in the Torah, you would then be on the hook, and the wife would have the right of first refusal to you if you took advantage, or the woman, the young virgin would have, I guess the longer virgin would have the right of first refusal to you as the man if you took advantage of her. And yeah, it's in the parsha this week. There you go. And so, but yeah, so I think the vows have to be there because there has to be a conscious effort. And this is not just in the Israelite text. This is even in the other ancient pagan Mesopotamian vows and from other cultures. They do have consent vows in their marriage contracts. It's not just. Yeah, go ahead.
On the flip side of that, we have, your question, modern marriages, right? These days, when you meet somebody, you fall in love, you go to the altar and exchange these vows. When you talk about, I didn't attend last week, it's my first day here.
Sure.
But
Welcome.
when you, thank you, when I think of a think of like a law, that you have a contract, right?
Yes, that's how it was
This is
seen.
what I vow to do, this is my responsibilities as a wife and as a husband, right? But we don't have that these days. We don't even have premarital counseling even, right?
Yeah.
In the modern world. So
Yes.
are those vows made with the I love yous, right? Are those even valid? Do they hold water?
Yeah.
If you don't have any contractual side to it.
There is something to that, I think, and that's what this kind of is about. So I want to get on a little bit, and if I have to cut off your questions, Laura, I'm sorry. I know you're very inquisitive. I appreciate that, but this is something I think is important. What is more important for a synagogue, or if you're a Christian, you're watching even a church, gaining new members or matchmaking current ones? I mean, in terms of sustainability, we sing this every day. La dor vado, la dor vado, la dor vado, nagid. From one generation to the next, from one generation to the next. So, which is more important? Outreach, or if you have people, this goes back to the Joshua Harris question. It's like, well, that's great that you wrote this book and you want courtship, but if the institution you're a part of isn't providing that for you, you're kind of in a fix, And so, but what are your thoughts on that? Outreach or taking care of your own?
I think in our situation, we need more people so we can make matches.
Yes, we have a critical mass problem in Messianic Judaism.
You don't have anybody to match.
No, that's the problem. Yeah, go ahead.
So the answer is yes.
Yeah. So
Yes and yes.
yeah. So I
Very
mean,
Jewish answer.
if you have, I guess the question is, if you have limited resources to devote to one or the other, outreach or, it's kind of like, I tend to fall into matchmaking being the more important, because it's like you got to take care of your own to some extent. It's like all these new people. It's kind of like Lot. He takes care of these guests, but like his own daughters, it's like it's sort of that mentality. But I'm going to go on to the next. So should Messianic Judaism, and this is I guess a question of us becoming a big boy religion with adult pants on, should we rely on the church for our customs and attitudes on marriage, divorce, and remarriage, or should we tap into normative Judaism?
Or the third option,
Blend on.
something,
Yeah, that's a thought. Yeah,
maybe neither,
neither.
or hybrid, or selecting
Take the best
the
of
best of both.
That's something. Anybody else?
Well, we've got one little problem, because what is the church? Catholicism is more of a thing unto itself, where people would only marry within that.
It's in documents.
But Protestantism is
It's
like
a galaxy.
shotgun.
It is a.
What are the customs? Who are these people?
Yes,
You
it's.
I think Messianic Judaism is striving to be, it's not more like Catholicism in content, but in the sense that it is a formed group
Yeah.
that is covenantal within itself.
Yeah.
It's not going to be a good idea, if you are a Messianic Jew, to marry someone from another
Yeah.
viewpoint.
Well, yeah. That's. I mean, we do have a long tradition in MJ, however, of accepting and fostering life for interweds and people like that. So I'm not
It
against.
happens,
Yeah.
but they would be brought in.
Yeah, they should be.
There
yeah.
wouldn't be some kind of like
You'd have
separate
a Ruth situation.
approach.
Yeah.
Drake, you should start an online Messianic Jewish dating.
And all 13 people would log on, and all.
They're everywhere out there. You start this one, you got it.
Oh well, there you go. Okay, so here's. Go ahead. Somebody said something.
The online thing?
I think people are saying
I know there's J-Date, and my therapist said I should do J-Date, but he's Jewish too. He was really. Yeah. Do. Say what? yeah, there you go. It's like it's at least it's plentiful at least. Do we in Messianic Judaism want Torah marriage? And I ask that with all the entailments there too. I mean, people say they want biblical Torah marriage. So okay, you saw all that went into it. And there's different gradations, obviously. There's Reform, there's Conservative, there's different. There's not a one size fits all, and nothing's all or nothing in Torah. But does Messianic Judaism, from the top up, in the organizations that we're a part of, what UMJC, is this something that we would maybe one day have a Beit Din that would take care of these kinds of things?
Eventually we would.
Yeah.
I think the ideal is the key is community.
Yeah.
So each one of these things, when you say Messianic Judaism, we are a small pool. We're a pond essentially.
Puddle.
Yeah, puddle.
Droplet.
So then when you start talking about the church, now you're really talking about a big body, and traditions and customs differ, and the community is so diverse. You can go from puddle to puddle all your entire life and get lost in all those puddles, and nobody from the other puddle would know whatever mess you made in the previous one.
Yes.
So that exists, but
that's not a problem so much in
Judaism
Catholicism, I mean.
Judaism is a little bit more.
Yeah. There's a what?
Judaism is a little bit more restrictive in that sense,
It
that it's
is.
a community where everybody knows everybody. The first questions that people ask you, about your family and where you're from and things like that,
Yeah.
and so we basically just don't have that, and so when that communal orientation exists, it changes a lot of the abuses, sort of say, automatically almost.
Yeah.
People do not have that, I'll just go jump into another puddle.
Yeah, there you go. I can escape discipline and excision by just going
But
somewhere
once
else.
you are a part of discipline and saying, all right, sorry, we count as an outsider. We look at you as a pagan now.
Yeah.
So I think bringing my business experience, one of the first things, this is kind of like a business analysis exercise, right? So one of the first things you do when you step in and do some business analysis, you ask this simple question: what's your pain point? Right? You want to fully understand the pain point and actually hear it before you come to solutions, right? So in a very real sense, what's the pain point? Well, let's be very blunt about it.
Like a people.
The concept of a family, yes, that's it in a heart, but the concept of a family, first off, putting aside the whole postmodern thing, right? Like, family can be anything you want it to be, right? No, but in the biblical sense of family, a family is like a special forces unit or a SEAL team in a vast sea of secularism, okay? So that's how hard it is to be a family in this world, right? And I think a lot of people recognize this.
Yeah.
In a sense, congregations, churches, etc., step in to sort of provide that support layer.
Yeah.
It used to exist in the form of your ethnicity, which is like your extended family, which you live next to.
Sure.
Doesn't exist anymore for most people.
You don't grow up and live and die on the same block.
Right.
So.
And maybe this exists in parts of Afghanistan and stuff, but then again, there's some other problems there.
So, I want to close with one question. And I've talked to some people in Messianic Judaism who are even veterans. And when I talk about this whole Torah marriage thing, they'll say, "Oh, thank goodness we don't do that anymore." And I'm like, when your Christian friends make fun of you, and they'll say, "Oh, there's all those burdensome regulations. Thank goodness that Christ nailed those to the cross," and that's how they. Thank goodness we. So if we say thank goodness, phew, that's close shave. We don't have to do that anymore. Are we ourselves not winking towards a kind of a softcore supersessionism? Because there's an idea that Rabbi Nathan Lopez Cardozo talks about, where it's like you have to bring the commandment forward. So technically, it's not, you wouldn't be stoned to death for turning a light switch on. But the orthodoxy maintains that because in a world without fireplaces, somehow that commandment has to express. Otherwise, it'll just become extinct. Or baking soda, on Passover for cookies, that might be frowned upon. I mean, you could technically do it, you wouldn't be excised for it, but it's sort of frowned upon in some circles because it's like, well, you're kind of obviating the commandment and you're letting the commandment die through some technological innovation like baking soda. And so to some extent, it's like you can't ignore it because it's in the Torah, it's part of God's word, and you have to make a place for it and make it work for life. So that's just my 2 cents. Listen, everybody, I really do appreciate the engagement, but it looks like we're a little bit 3 minutes past. And that's a good sign, and I appreciate all the curious hands. And Laura, if you have more questions, I can definitely get to them. I am very humbled by your